Wonderful to have you back. Today we're going to talk about the brain and technology. Now, you may have heard that the brain operates like a computer, but in fact, that's not true. I like to say just let the brain be the brain, because it's important not to force the brain to work in ways that are counterproductive. Let me give you two examples. Those of you that teach or have taught in the past recognize that in multiple choice tests you have students that will be reading the questions over and over and taking fine points and weighing them. And actually, for the well-prepared student, the best thing is to simply read the question and choose the correct answer. Now, the second example concerns my own daughter. I remember when she was a small child, I took her to an eye exam. And those of you who had your eyes examined know that towards the end of the exam, the doctor's putting a very finely distinguished lens in front of one eye and then comparing it. Compare lens A to lens B. And when you really get to the end of the exam, there's hardly any difference at all. So my daughter, when he asked her, is it lens A or lens B, she said, well, let me think it over for a minute. And he said, well, it's not something you think over. You just look at it and say what it is. So my point is, you don't try to micromanage your brain by giving it too much conscious direction. In fact, it may surprise you to know that the lion's share of brain processing is taking place unconsciously, as when we're dancing or driving a car. If you learned a new dance step, the worst thing you can do is become very actively aware of your feet and where they are and all that. You've got to sort of get into the rhythm of it. Same thing with driving a car. I'm referring here to the cognitive unconscious, which is the mental processing that takes place outside of conscious awareness. And that is the main part of our mental processing. And it starts at the level of neuron and expands all the way upward to the level of everyday behavior. For example, neuronal responses in the primary auditory cortex are tuned to the personal meaning of the sound. The more important the sound, the more attuned the cell becomes. You've had the experience of being, let's say, at a cocktail party, and it's a lot of people, and it's noisy, and you hear someone say your name a little way across the room, and you say to the person you're talking to, did you hear someone just called my name? They say, no, I didn't hear it. Well, they didn't hear it because their brain isn't attuned to the sound of your name. Now, this preferential recognition can be measured. Your brain responds to the ringtone of your cell phone, for instance, within 40 milliseconds of the first ring. Now, that's not true when you're hearing other people's cell phone rings. Now, those examples give you the idea of what I'm talking about when I mention the cognitive unconscious. But I don't want you to think that just because the brains are not mechanistic and that they don't work like computers, that we can't take advantage of computers and other technology to enhance our brain function. In fact, this lecture will explore the ways that we do that. First of all, a very important point, and that is that culture rather than biology is now the greatest influence on brain development. In fact, our culture is inseparable from technology and has been so since the development of the microchip, which is the heart of modern technology. We use portable computers to extend the brain's power. Software programs enhance our speed of response, our working memory, our imaging ability, our reasoning, our ability to calculate, and also abstraction. Now think of technological aids as extensions of the brain. Our species, if you go back in history, started with the sharpened stones in prehistory and evolved to handwritten scrolls, then to the printing press, pencils, pens, then to typewriters, and finally computer keyboards. Each offered an advance in information management. Now let's talk a little bit about the history of information management, because we have an evolution of possible ways to remember something. Back in history, people heard something and they sustained it in their short-term memory and then moved it into long-term memory. That's how we have the Homeric epics. Later, we started writing things down and dictating notes about them. Still later came the typewriter and then the laptop. And all these methods are what we could think of as one-stop sources for writing and editing. Or another way of thinking about it, all are extensions of the brain. Now let's look at the advantages and disadvantages of each. Let's start with written journals. It's amazing how many people I've known have kept journals. I met a woman 89 years of age who had kept journals since she was 8 years old. It filled 2 whole bookshelves. So written journals are very personal. They're intimate. They're familiar. We actually see the brain's production in the form of our own handwriting. But we have limited access to written journals over time. This woman couldn't find a particular journal that went back 20 or 30 years, and you can understand why. Also, as we change, our handwriting is sometimes difficult to read. Written documents are difficult to index as well. You're trying to find something, you say, I know I wrote something about this a year or two ago, and you go through a journal and you can't find the correct one. And synthesis and integration is difficult because you can't link and index. Now, compare that to computer journals. With multi-megabyte drives, you can cross-correlate every day's entry with everything you've ever written, or in fact ever will write. Now, this is a great improvement over our dependency on books, which aren't always available when we want them. Now I have all my books on my laptop. Thoughts and images of the past influence what I'm writing now. It's really a form of future memory, as we discussed earlier. What you did in the past influences what you're thinking now, and then that, of course, will influence what you accomplish in the future. Now, in the book Total Recall, Gordon Bell, who is the principal researcher at Microsoft Research, tells of the power unleashed by combining digital recording, digital storage, and digital search. He writes, with the speed of modern computers, it has become possible to index every word and phrase in every document and to search all of them in an instant. Indexing is the mechanism by which associative memory becomes possible. And of course, as I mentioned, you don't have any indexing when you're writing something in a handwritten journal. So they have advantages of electronic journals. You don't have to deal with handwriting. You can correlate your entries via keywords. A keyword search turns up surprising connections many times. That's the advantage of the surfing, as we call it. You come up with connections that you really never thought of. It's also easy to modify and to add something. Can't do that to a journal that was written 10 years ago when there's no space left. Now, automated research, of course, has limitations. There are advantages and disadvantages. These search programs aren't able to find correlations and connections that you would yourself, that would come naturally to you. You could also change the program midstream and see things from a different perspective, as mentioned in the lecture on puzzles, word games, and humor. Nonetheless, the computer has brought about dramatic changes in the way we think. A personal computer, in fact, brings about a fundamental change in our fundamental experience, our subjective experience. We can link past, present, and future to create personal synthesis and integration. We can revisit earlier thoughts and productions. The you of right now can revisit the you of an earlier time. You can think of it as a form of experiential time travel. Now, the computer has a great influence on the brain. It's changing the structure and functioning of the brain, as a matter of fact, and we're going to be talking about throughout this whole lecture. A mobile electronic device frees us from desks and offices. We can be creative and productive anywhere. Even on vacation, if we want to, we can look up something and tabulate it. We can research and use cross-references with hyperlinks and hypertext. Let me tell you about a personal example of technology using and enhancing learning. Remember the paper I mentioned a few moments ago of the brain recognizing the ringtone of your own personal cell phone? I wondered about that research and the fact that, people select their own ringtones. When you got your cell phone, you picked one you thought reflected your personality, and that's your ringtone. So I thought, I wonder what would happen if somebody were to assign a ringtone and have them then tested and see if the brain would pick it up in 40 milliseconds. Well, I emailed my question to the author, who is at Leipzig, Germany, and I said, let's try to test it next time with an assigned ringtone. Within an hour, he got back to me and stated, I've already done that. And I came up with the same finding. My point here is that an informational exchange that could have taken days or weeks sped by in an hour. Let's talk a little bit now about the experiential aspects of technology and how technology is changing what's real. I recently watched on YouTube Pablo Casals playing Suite No. 1 of the cello suites of Johann Sebastian Bach. Now, prior to watching this, my knowledge of Casals depended on historical accounts and his recordings. Watching his performance augmented my understanding and appreciation in a very deep way. This immediately led me to watch the performance of the suites by Jacqueline du Pré. Thanks to this, on YouTube, I was able to experientially connect in ways that would have been impossible a few years ago. Technology here provides a form of immortality, if you will. I can see and hear and connect with an artist who died in 1973. There's also a dark side to technology and its influence on the brain. Technology presents impediments to brain enhancement as well as opportunities. In fact, we're now, as a New York Times article put it, hooked on gadgets and paying a mental price. By juggling email and cell phones and laptop computers and e-books, we're bringing about changes in how our brains operate. And we're in the age of distraction, where attention and focus are becoming endangered species. Concentration is decreased and distraction increases. We simply have too many sources of information. Marshall McLuhan referred to it as information overload. Now, the top-down processing by the frontal lobes is interfered with by the excessive bottom-up informational processing coming in through the sensory channels. As a result of this, the deep processing of information is replaced by skimming and surfing. Memory is also interfered with because mental focusing is difficult, thanks to scattered attention and distraction. And finally, the technology of the internet, cell phone, texting, etc., encourage multitasking, which we discussed in the lecture on attention. Multitasking arguments, pro and con, as you recall, as I mentioned in that lecture, that multitasking is a myth. The brain works sequentially, doesn't have concurrent activities. There's also an interference effect when you use the same channel, like when you're trying to listen to something and trying to write something at the same time. Perhaps it's okay if you have separate channels, but it's not ideal by any means. It's better to deal with everything separately. Now, mental channels can also interfere with physical channels. Imagining one scene while looking at another, like you're on a cell phone talking about something at home and you're trying to envision it, while you're actually supposed to be envisioning what's happening in front of you in the highway. That's because of the bottleneck in the frontal lobes and the cerebral geography that we talked about, in which every part of the brain is specialized for something, and therefore you don't want to overload it. Now let's add a few additional points about multitasking. Hypertext is a good example, and that's a form of multitasking. You're reading something and you see the hypertext, and you need to evaluate, do I want to leave the main work that I'm looking and look at this hyperlink? Or if you do, then you have to decide whether or not to click on it. If you decide to click on it, you have to decide when you're going to return to the original text. Of course, that's sometimes hard to remember when the original text you don't remember because you've been on so many hyperlinks. So there's pros and cons of internet reading. A 2007 study showed that shifting from one document to another interferes with understanding. We really do better when we do one thing at a time. The cognitive load, which is the information entering the memory, can be exceeded at such times. That's because of that bottleneck in the frontal lobes, which I just mentioned. The internet can function as an interrupter as well. Whatever you're doing is suddenly interrupted, with its emphasis on speed, reading more, and, unfortunately, retaining less. These online interruptions could be email, advertisements, pop-ups. And, of course, we all have curiosity about what we're missing. Something's happening and we're missing, so we check the email, check the instant messages and the automatic alerts, which in some cases are 30 or more times in an hour. 30 or more an hour. Think about that. Overall, there's a decrease in efficiency due to switching costs, which increase cognitive load. Now, multitasking, the bottom line is that the depth, clarity, and cohesion of thought take time. Time that you just simply have to find. And it also requires focused attention. All of these are impaired by the multitasking that the internet encourages. So what about videos? What effect do they have? And what do they induce in the brain? The video screen, of course, has evolved from the first television screen to the computer screen and the video game screen. And there is a shift in brain functioning from the left to the right hemisphere. And this explains why critical, logical thinking is always better from reading text, from reading paper, than it is by looking at a screen. It's been shown in numerous studies that when people are learning some information or trying to learn it, they do much better when they're reading it from a book or from a paper than they do when they're reading it from a television. And that's because of this imbalance between the left and right hemispheres. Same thing happens in proofreading. An experienced proofreader will much prefer to read in the final parts an actual printed copy than to be doing it all on the monitor. Of course, there are benefits from videos. They can make it possible to re-experience an event through multiple sensory channels. Let me give you an example. I photographed a previous winter's 3 blizzards here in Washington, where blizzards are fairly rare. Nothing like it had occurred since 1899. A few months later, I looked at those pictures on a warm, sunny day. Same terrain, different world. Technology made that possible. You can do the same thing yourself by looking at pictures and videos that you've made and compare them to where you are now and what things are like at the moment. The most powerful influence of video, however, is video gaming. The emergence and burgeoning of video gaming is comparatively recent. 500 million gamers globally spend more than an hour a day playing games. The hardcore gamers spend 25 hours a week. The World of Warcraft, or WoW, has 10 million subscribers, averaging 12.5 hours a week. 40% of Americans are regular players, with 60% of them men, 40% women. The average age is not 16, not 17, not 18, but 35. So it's safe to say that video gaming is here to stay. That's all the more reason that we understand the positive and negative effects that happen with video gaming. Some are obvious, of course. If you spend 25 hours a week playing video games, that cuts into your relationships. It's also escapism. As one video gamer said, I could either work in a fast food chain or be a starship captain. Now, video games do provide an easy route, prestige and social advancement among one's peers. Success playing WoW, World of Warcraft, brings quicker recognition than a high grade in a semester course. In fact, some students turn to video games as an escape from academic difficulties. But what are the effects on the brain? What happens when we're doing video games? Well, they first of all provide immediate performance feedback. A Nature study in 2003 showed that action video games improve peripheral visual attention. There's also enhanced eye-hand coordination and reflex responses, and also increased contrast sensitivity, which is important in night driving when vision is reduced. The games involving teamwork also increase collaboration skills. So there is research on video gaming done by primarily Daphne Bavelier and Sean Green, her assistant, at the Center for Visual Science, University of Rochester. They carried out an interesting experiment in which they compared students who did and did not play video games. Now, they had some problem finding students who didn't play at least some video games, but they kept searching and they eventually had a control group. And they compared them to the action video gamers. This is the experiment. Everybody stared at a screen, and a random target was flashed in one of 24 possible areas, followed by a flooding of the screen with a clutter of objects. Each was asked, where had the target originally appeared on the screen? Now, the regular video game players were 80% accurate. They could remember and go back through all that the chaos that occurred briefly and remember that first flash. Non-players were only 30% accurate. Now, the attentional blink is also reduced. Attentional blink refers to the time required to detect a second target during a rapid-fire target sequence, flashing white flashes at you, and suddenly you recognize one and you'll miss the next one and maybe the one after that because of attentional blink. Subitizing is also improved by 50%. Now, subitizing is what happens when you go into the supermarket and you're leaving, you want to check out, and you quickly look at all the different lines and decide which one is the shortest. You don't count everybody. You just sort of say, well, that seems to be shorter, so I'm going to get in that line. Of course, that has nothing to do with how fast you'll get out of the store, but it does show that you can subitize and get into the line that has the fewer number of people in it. Wisely used, video games can help you notice more, concentrate better, respond quicker, and also increase some components of your IQ. The principal benefits are acquiring specific real-world skills. Airline pilots for at least 20 years have been getting in simulators, which essentially are a video game. I've been in myself with pilots and seen them as very challenging. You think that you're actually in an airline cockpit, but it's simulated. Also, surgeons are able to do some of the surgical operations, some of the procedures on a video game. Also, musicians can improve. Guitar Hero and other programs can do this. In fact, video games are more likely to enhance your brain function than the so-called brain gyms that you see advertised. Video games are more likely to keep your mind and emotions engaged than the repetitive so-called mental workouts provided by the commercial brain training programs. So until we have some solid scientific evidence of the cognitive benefits of these commercial programs, it makes more sense to devote your energies to games you enjoy. You can use what you know about your emotions and your associative memory. Now, I do want to mention some caveats about video games. There's evidence that video games can be harmful and addictive and habit-forming. There's cases in Korea of players tracking down and attacking others for killing their avatars. As a result, blackout times have been mandated by South Korea's Ministry of Culture, Sports, and Tourism. Players have to choose from 3 6-hour blackout blocks. And during these periods, the users are locked out. The ministry is also stepping down the speed of internet connections for late-night players, therefore making the games less playable. These measures are the result of a 2005 case of a 28-year-old man who died after 50 straight hours of playing without stopping to eat or drink. It's also a case of parents who allowed their baby to starve to death while raising a virtual child during a 12-hour marathon session on Prius Online, which is the South Korean version of Second Life. There have been 9 additional deaths attributed to online addiction. It's getting so serious that China and South Korea have opened internet boot camps, complete with military-style training to get people away from these games. In the UK, the first technology dependence clinic opened in London in mid-2010. Here in the U.S., efforts are being made to add video game addiction to the next edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is known as DSM. Now, you're probably thinking, why are video games so potentially harmful? 2 reasons. There's things called high-intensity immersion, in which you become so absorbed you isolate yourself from everybody else, your 12-hour sessions in your room by yourself. The second is situated immersion, the illusion of literally existing within the game. Now, intensity, vividness, and the quality of graphics will determine the tendency for immersion. And also, the richness and qualities of one's personal life offsets the likelihood of immersion. There's evidence that the unemployed and the socially isolated are likely to overuse. I also mentioned students who aren't doing well. They often will move on to a video game where they can be more immediately successful. Now, the number of adult overusers, and we could call them addicts, now exceeds the number of teens that are overusing in some countries such as South Korea. As I mentioned, the South Korean case of parents so addicted to an online game that they played 12 hours or more at a time to the neglect of their own child who died of malnutrition. There's a couple of ways you can limit the risk of immersion. First of all, by playing no more than 2 or 3 hours a week and try to keep it to that. Then limit the sessions to not more than an hour. Then I have a way of powering down after session by applying what I call the Henry James test. Remember Henry James, a 19th and 20th century author who was a bit wordy and sometimes a bit difficult to see where he was going, and there wasn't a lot of action and so forth. You could use him or other wordy authors that cause you to focus and you have to pay attention to what's going on, and there's not a lot of emphasis on fast action. This works as a test of your power of sustained attention. Now, caveat 2, avoid games which feature gratuitous violence, especially games like Columbine and Virginia Tech. Douglas Gentile, who is director of the media research at the Iowa State University, has found evidence from MRI that violent video games may lead to desensitization. The rostral anterior cingulate cortex, or RACC, is important for emotional responses, and the frequency of this firing is less active during a violent game compared to players who don't usually play violent video games. So the ones who are playing the game frequently, they have less action. In other words, those players who are not used to seeing violent images show a strong emotional reaction to those images. This emotional reaction is missing in players of violent video games. The research suggests that habitual players of violent video games become desensitized to violence in the video games and perhaps even in real life. A study of over 1,500 children drawn from the U.S. and Japan found that children who play violent games tend to be more aggressive in real life. We learn from what we see and we learn from what we practice. The challenge is to reap the benefits of action video games while avoiding the potential downsides. Now, that's not as easily done as it first appears. I was curious a year or so ago, and I spent several months studying the profiles and reading and watching interviews of game designers. Many of them, sad to say, came across to me as a neuropsychiatrist as a bit antisocial and a bit addicted or very much taken up with reveling in violence. Now, that's certainly not true by any means of all video game players. Let's emphasize the positives. You get decreased overall reaction times, increased eye-hand coordination, enhanced manual dexterity, improved spatial visualization. You're better able to work in 3 dimensions, and you can divide and rapidly switch your attention. You also can increase the number of things you can visually attend to at one time. Going forward, our society will get the video games it demands. So let's think positively and emphasize the positive aspects of video gaming. According to researcher Sean Green, video game research is opening a fascinating window into the amazing capability of the brain and behavior to be reshaped by experience. So we have positive applications of video games, and they include games in which you have real-world problems. You make a real-world problem into a game. There's opportunities for advancement in status and rewards. It's called leveling up in the game world, and it's getting some prestige in a legitimate way. For example, there's a game called Evoke by serious game designer Jane McGonigal, which involves creative collaborations on solving world problems like water safety and food security. Other real-world games include Darfur is Dying, which is managing a refugee camp, or World Without Oil, which is responding to a simulated world oil crisis. There's another one called Play the News, in which players take on the role of world leaders facing various crises. And there's one called Fate of the World, which calls the shots. You have to call the shots over the next 200 years of global warming. Video games can also be employed to improve mental and physical conditioning, as with the Wii Fitness program, which simulates various sports such as tennis and boxing. The important thing is to find activities that match your own interests and that you will enjoy practicing. In the next lecture, we'll explore more ways to build up your cognitive reserve.